Good morning, everyone. The 9,010th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, before we adopt the agenda, I'd like to express our protest in connection with the fact that the just started British presidency dealt with our two requests to convene a Security Council in connection with the horrific provocation of the Ukrainian forces in Bucha. Now, from the beginning, the first meeting which we requested on the Sunday, 3rd of April, for Monday at 3 p.m., and then an emergency meeting which we requested at 12 o'clock on the 4th of April, after you refused our first request. We considered that it was possible to blatantly violate the rules of the Council and for the second time issue a decision that wasn't coordinated with anyone, that it would be better to discuss this topic today. This is an outrageous situation set out in my letter to you yesterday as an official document of the Council. I would like to ask you, on what basis do you feel that you can act in such an outrageous way in contravention of all existing norms and rules? Don't you know that in case you don't agree with our proposal, you should have convened a meeting and put forward the issue of the advisability of holding a meeting for a vote, especially since you should have had before you the example of our presidency, where we didn't refuse a single time to convene any of the 6 meetings on Ukraine. We demand an explanation from you, and we hope that in the future you will not challenge the right of members of the Security Council to request a meeting enshrined in Rule 2.
Call a meeting of the Security Council at the request of any member of the Security Council.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. Is there anyone else who wants to comment on this? I will explain the presidency's position in just a moment. Okay. If I could respond to your points from the Russian Federation, we did not reject your request for a meeting. We received your letter on Sunday, and it is the responsibility, with the obligation of the presidency to schedule a meeting. You particularly requested a meeting for a time on Monday. Our proposal as presidency was to schedule the meeting either alongside the meeting today, so well within the 48-hour limit, which is the convention of the Security Council, or to hold the meetings sequentially, one after the other. And I understand that the Russian Federation turned down both proposals, but I wish to be clear that we did not reject the request for a meeting. The deferral proposed was less than 24 hours, and to be clear, we share the view that this is an urgent situation, and we have, as I say, offered the Russian Federation either a separate meeting today or to combine it with this one. And so, as far as the presidency is concerned, we did everything in line with the provisional rules of procedure and with precedent. We have received no other complaints from council members on the subject. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you.
У нас есть доказательства,
We have evidence,
фактические доказательства того, что это было не менее чем за 24 часа до заседания, которое мы просили провести.
24 hours before the meeting that we requested.
Это все зафиксировано документально.
This is
если это кому-то интересно, мы готовы это представить.
in documents. If anyone is interested, we can provide proof. But I want to express the hope that what you said today means that you will not in the future refuse member states of the Security Council to hold meetings when they request for it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. The presidency will not refuse to host meetings in the future, and I hope that that now closes that point and we can proceed with the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated the 28th of February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. I should like to start by taking the opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of this Council to Her Excellency Lana Naseba, the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates, for your service as the President of the Council for the month of March. I'm sure I speak for all of us in expressing our deep appreciation to Ambassador Naseba and her team for the skillful conduct of the Council's business last month. Thank you very much indeed to your team. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine, and just add that, as usual precedent, the permanent representative of Ukraine will also join the meeting in case of any technical issues. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome His Excellency the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and I give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order and the global peace architecture founded on the United Nations Charter, because of its nature, intensity, and consequences. We are dealing with the full-fledged invasion on several fronts of one member state of the United Nations, Ukraine, by another, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, in violation of the United Nations Charter, and with several aims, including redrawing the internationally recognized borders between the two countries. The war has led to senseless loss of life, massive devastation in urban centers, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. I will never forget the horrifying images of civilians killed in Bucha, and I immediately called for an independent investigation to guarantee effective accountability. And I'm also deeply shocked by the personal testimony of rapes and sexual violence that now are emerging. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law. And the Russian offensive has also led to the displacement of more than 10 million people in just 1 month, the fastest forced population movement since the Second World War. Far beyond Ukraine's borders, the war has led to massive increases in prices of food, energy and fertilizers, because Russia and Ukraine are linchpins of these markets. It has disrupted supply chains and increased the cost of transportation, putting even more pressure on the developing world. Many developing countries are already on the verge of debt collapse due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of adequate liquidity and debt relief, stemming ultimately from the unfair nature of our global economic and financial system. For all these reasons, it is more urgent by the day to silence the guns. That is why I asked the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, to travel to Russia and Ukraine to press for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. And the Secretary-General Griffiths will update you on the humanitarian situation and the results of his contacts so far. And the Secretary-General DiCarlo will also brief you on the political and human rights dimensions. But, Secretary-General of the United Nations, it is my duty to call the attention of the Council to the serious damage being done to the global economy and particularly to vulnerable people and developing countries. Madam President, our analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a total population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy, and fertilizer costs. Debt obligations take up some 16% of developing countries' export earnings, and in small island developing states, the figure is 34% and rising because of increased interest rates and the need to pay for expensive imports. In the past months alone, wheat prices have increased by 22%, maize by 21%, and barley by 31%. Brent oil prices on the 1st of April were more than 60% higher than at the same time last year. A series of events have led to that, not only the present situation. Natural gas and fertilizer prices more than double over the same period. We are already seeing some countries move from vulnerability into crisis and signs of serious social unrest. The flames of conflict are fueled by inequality, deprivation, and underfunding. With all the warning signals flashing red, we have a duty to act. Madam President, the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance that I set up last month has formulated some initial recommendations for the consideration of Member States, international financial institutions, and others. On food, we are urging all countries to keep markets open, resist unjustified and unnecessary export restrictions, and make reserves available to countries at risk of hunger and famine. This is not the time for protectionism. Humanitarian appeals must be fully funded. People caught up in crisis around the world cannot pay the price for this war. On energy, the use of strategic stockpiles and additional reserves could help ease this energy crisis in the short term. But the only medium and long-term solution is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, which is not impacted by market fluctuations. These will allow the progressive phase-out of coal and other fossil fuels, and renewables are already cheaper in most of the cases. And on finance, international financial institutions must go into emergency mode. We need urgent action by the G20 and international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space so that governments can provide safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable. The reform I've been calling for the global financial system is long overdue. All these actions are closely linked with the prevention agenda and with building and sustaining peace. Madam President, the war in Ukraine must stop now. We need serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. This Council is charged with maintaining peace and doing so in solidarity. I deeply regret the divisions that have prevented the Security Council from acting not only on Ukraine, but on other threats to peace and security around the world. I urge the Council to do everything in its power to end the war and to mitigate its impact, both on the suffering people of Ukraine and on vulnerable people in developing countries around the world, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary-General for his remarks. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, since I last briefed this Council on 17 March, the security situation in Ukraine has seriously deteriorated. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed has more than doubled. Ukrainian cities continue to be mercilessly pounded, often indiscriminately, by heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. And hundreds of thousands of people, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, remain trapped in encircled areas under nightmarish conditions. The devastation wrought on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is one of the shameful hallmarks of this senseless war. The horror deepened this past weekend as shocking images emerged of dead civilians, some with hands bound, lying in the streets of Bucha, the town near Kiev formerly held by Russian forces. Many bodies were also found in a mass grave in the same locality. Reports by non-governmental organizations and media also allege summary executions of civilians, rape and looting in Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Madam President, away from the fighting, diplomatic efforts to end this war, including direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives, have continued. We commend the government of Turkey for hosting these discussions, as well as the efforts of many others engaging with Russia and Ukraine to help bring about peace. We welcome the willingness of the sides to continue engaging to reach a mutual understanding. This requires good faith and earnest efforts, and progress in the negotiations should be translated quickly into action on the ground. While there has been a reported reduction of Russian troops in attacks around Kyiv and Chernihiv, such moves should not be merely tactical, repositioning forces for renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns elsewhere. The General Assembly has twice called for Russian forces to withdraw entirely from Ukrainian territory and cease all military operations. We also take note of the reported withdrawal of Russian forces from around the Chernobyl nuclear site. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that this development will hopefully allow it to conduct an assistance and support mission to provide technical advice and to deliver equipment where necessary as soon as possible. All nuclear sites in Ukraine must be fully protected and secured. Military operations in or around these locations must be avoided. Madam President, the numbers tell a tragic, if yet incomplete, story. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 1,480 civilians have been killed and at least 2,195 injured between 24 February and 4 April 2022. OHCHR believes that the actual figures are considerably higher. We are gravely concerned by the persistent use of explosive weapons with the wide impact area in or near populated areas. Such weapons are causing most civilian casualties, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, water stations, and electricity systems. OHCHR has received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. Allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons are also being investigated. As noted by the High Commissioner, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have not been sufficiently adhered to. In besieged cities, a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians can also be attributed to the disruption of medical care and basic services. People with disabilities and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. As of 4 April 2022, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 85 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in at least 72 fatalities and 43 injuries. Madam President, we are seriously concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of persons who have been vocal against the Russian invasion. As of 30 March, OHCHR has documented the arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society members in Kyiv, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 24 local officials have also been detained in regions under Russian control, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained, including journalists, local officials, civil society activists, and others. Also, as of 30 March, OHCHR has recorded 7 journalists and media workers killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to seek to verify all these allegations. We're also concerned about disturbing videos depicting abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. All prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the many credible allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law from areas recently retaken from Russian forces must not go unanswered. We support efforts to examine these allegations and to gather evidence. Ensuring accountability and justice for acts committed during the war will not be easy, but it is essential. Madam President, we are heartened by the generosity of neighboring countries who have accepted millions of refugees and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people who are hosting their displaced compatriots. With more than 10 million people displaced either within Ukraine or abroad as refugees, roughly 1/4 of the population, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the heightened risk of human trafficking. Indeed, suspected and verified cases of human trafficking are surfacing in the surrounding countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. Madam President, this war is devastating Ukraine now, but it also threatens its future. Early assessment projections by UNDP suggest that if the war continues through 2022, Ukraine faces the prospect of seeing 18 years of socioeconomic progress lost. This would set the country and the region back decades and leave deep long-term social and economic fissures. UN agencies, including UNDP, are working to help preserve Ukraine's hard-won development gains. This involves supporting the government to sustain essential government structures and basic services, including emergency measures to sustain livelihoods, such as cash-based assistance. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has damaged Europe's security architecture. Its economic repercussions are already evident far from the battlefield. The longer the war continues, the greater the risk that it will further weaken the global institutions and mechanisms dedicated to preserve peace and security. The war was started by choice. There is no inevitability to it or to the suffering it is causing. The United Nations is ready to do everything within its means to help bring an end to it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam President. As you've just heard from the Secretary General and Under Secretary General De Carlo, Ukrainian civilians are paying far too high a price for this war. I want to speak briefly about humanitarian needs and what we're doing to meet them before I then refer to my recent travels. In the last 6 weeks, as we have heard, at least 1,430 people have been killed, among them over 121 children, and we know this is very likely a serious underestimate. Homes and civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools have been damaged and destroyed. And in fact, the current figures on displacement tell us that more than 11.3 million people have now been forced to flee their homes, and of that, 4.2 million are now refugees in those generous neighboring countries that Rosemary has just been referring to. So in total, more than a quarter of the population of Ukraine has fled in this extraordinary short time. And unfortunately, we can imagine that these figures will continue to rise until we can find a pause and some peace. Madam President, the ground and air offensives and counteroffensives are making life nearly impossible for many civilians in Ukraine. Families, the elderly, women and children have been trapped by fighting already for too long. For more than 5 weeks, the people of Mariupol have been caught up in the fighting. And it is well documented that really Mariupol is a center of hell. Other cities like Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv remain cut off from essential goods and services. and perilous conditions are hampering our efforts to access civilians or for them to access us. And we restate here that civilians must be allowed to move to safer areas without the fear of attacks and at their own choice and at their own selection. It's vital that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to allow impartial humanitarian organizations safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need wherever they are in Ukraine. Madam President, as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, the United Nations and our partner organizations are making every effort to dramatically increase our support to affected civilians. The work of the 6,000 volunteers from the Ukraine Red Cross, as we have noted before in this chamber, together with local NGOs in eastern Ukraine, these people, these organizations continue to work tirelessly at the front line of assistance to communities. The World Food Programme has reached more than 1.3 million people with cash and food assistance and plans to push that number up to 2.5 million people in this month. Health partners report that more than 180 tons of medical supplies were delivered in Ukraine, with another 470 tons on the way. And this will address the health needs of around 6 million people in the months ahead. And I'm pleased to say, that seems an odd word to say in the context of Ukraine, that after much effort in the past day, another convoy went from our humanitarian hub in Dnipro to the Far East. Today, food, winter clothing, non-food items, medicine, hygiene kits were offloaded to the Ukraine Red Cross and will reach the hands of those most in need. Indeed, following notification to both parties, a formal process that we and also the International Red Cross are engaged in, 4 convoys in total from the UN have provided critical support to people in some of the cities encircled by war and affected by ongoing fighting. Several more are planned. So these are initial steps, but it gives us a basis to now expand and taking our efforts up to scale and expanding much more than 1 convoy a day. As the Secretary General and the Undersecretary General has already said, I want to also join them in expressing my concern over the growing number of reports we receive of human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse in Ukraine and in the region. And as ever, such horrific incidents as we're seeing, they overwhelmingly impact displaced women and children more than others. We're bolstering protection and gender-based violence services through agencies to provide specialized care for survivors and through the wealth of civil society organizations in Ukraine. These services are designed, carried out directly in collaboration with and through Ukrainian civil society, including, very particularly, women-led organizations. Madam President, today I'm addressing you from Geneva, having just returned from Moscow overnight. As you know, the Secretary General, as he said, charged me to bring both sides together on humanitarian grounds to explore both specific and sustained ways to reduce humanitarian suffering, including in particular, inter alia, but in particular, the pursuit of a humanitarian ceasefire. Yesterday in Moscow, I had long and frank exchanges with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his deputy, Sergei Vershinin, and then separately with Alexander Fomin, the Deputy Minister of Defense. In my meetings with these senior officials, I discussed also, in addition to these possibilities of humanitarian ceasefires, I discussed the issue of humanitarian convoys of safe passage, including the 4 which I've already referred to. I outlined possibilities for building further on that cooperation, sharing specific suggestions for mutually agreed upon military freezes to allow for evacuation of civilians and for the safe passage of life-saving aid. in effect for humanitarian pauses in different parts of Ukraine to save lives and bring back a modicum of safety for those living in those places. My counterparts in Moscow received these suggestions, assured me of their intent to carefully study those ideas, which I left with them. And we agreed to remain in close contact. And I came away from these meetings believing that we have a very long road ahead of us, but it must be traveled. And Madam President, we will travel it. Tomorrow I plan to travel to Ukraine to have discussions with senior authorities from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv on Thursday on these same issues and others that they will no doubt present to me, and also to see firsthand with our crisis coordinator, Amin Awad, the Humanitarian Response. Madam President, thanks to generous donor contributions, many from governments in this chamber, the Humanitarian Response since February has indeed been scaled up, allowing us to meet the needs of 1.5 million people. We will need sustained financial support for needs in Ukraine. And like the Secretary General, I want to stress, as he has done consistently, that funding must not be diverted from other crises. And Madam President, for Afghanistan, and that is one example. And as you heard from David Beasley last week, conflict, climate shocks, COVID, compounded by the soaring food and fuel costs indicated by the Secretary General, could push another 47 million people globally into severe food insecurity. And so the total number of people around the world who will not know where their next meal comes from could be driven to the astonishing figure of 325 million people around the world. That is by a long distance the highest in our recent history, and well over double what it was 3 years ago. So, Madam President, I close, of course, like others, by reminding the Council of what the Council already knows well. The world cannot afford this war, and neither can the people of Ukraine. And like others, I call on all Council members and member states with influence to support all efforts from whatever part they come from in the pursuit of peace and the alleviation of humanitarian suffering, for the sake of the people of Ukraine, for the sake of those around the world who cannot afford to bear the additional burden this war imposes on them and all of us. We must, as the Secretary General said, silence the guns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, dear Madam Chairman. Dear Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council and other members of this meeting, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sure that all the representatives of the United Nations member states will hear me today. Yesterday, I returned from our city of Bucha, recently liberated from Russian troops, not far from Kyiv. So there is not a single crime that they would not commit there. The Russian military searched for and purposefully killed anyone who served our country. They shot and killed women outside their houses when they just tried to call someone who is alive. They killed entire families, adults and children, and they tried to burn the bodies. I am addressing you on behalf of the people who honor the memory of the deceased every single day, in the memory of the civilians who died, who were shot and killed in the back of their head after being tortured. Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into the wells, so they died there in suffering. They were killed in their apartments, houses, blowing up grenades. The civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, just for their pleasure. They cut off limbs, cut their throats, slashed their throats. Women were raped and killed in front of their children. President. Their tongues were pulled out only because the aggressor did not hear what they wanted to hear from them. So this is no different from other terrorists such as Daesh who occupied some territories. And here it is done by a member of the United Nations Security Council, destroying internal unity, borders, countries, and taking the right of more than a dozen countries who are self-determined and independent. They pursue a consistent policy of destroying ethnic and religious diversity. They inflame wars and deliberately lead them in such a way that to kill as many regular civilians and cities, to leave the country where they deploy their troops in ruins and filled with mass graves. You all see that. And they support hatred at the level of the state and seek to export it to other countries through their system of propaganda and political corruption. They provoke a global food crisis that could lead to famine in Africa, Asia, and other countries, and will surely end in large-scale political chaos in many countries, and destroying their domestic security. So where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. So where is the peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggressor to peace, simply cannot work effectively. Now the world can see that what Russian military did in Bucha while keeping the city under their occupation, but the world has yet to see what they have done in other occupied cities and regions of our country. Geography might be different or various, but cruelty is the same, crimes are the same, and accountability must be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you of Article 1, Chapter 1 of the UN Charter. What is the purpose of our organization? Its purpose is to maintain peace and make sure that peace is adhered to. And now the UN Charter is violated literally, starting with the Article 1. And if so, what is the point of all other articles? Today, as a result of Russia's actions in our country, in Ukraine, the most terrible war crimes of all times we see since the end of World War II, and they are being committed. Russian troops are deliberately destroying Ukrainian cities to ashes with artillery and airstrike. They are deliberately blocking cities, creating mass starvation. They deliberately shoot columns of civilians on the road trying to escape from the territory of hostilities. They even deliberately blow up shelters where civilians hide from airstrikes. They are deliberately creating conditions in the temporarily occupied territories so that as many civilians as possible are killed there. The massacre in our city of Bucha is only one, unfortunately, only one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing on our land for the past 41 days. And there are many more cities, similar places where the world has yet to learn the full truth. Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernobyl, Tyrka, Borodyanka, and dozens other Ukrainian communities. Each of them is similar to Bucha. I know, and you know perfectly well what the representatives of Russia will say in response to the accusations of these crimes. They have said that many times. The most significant was after the shooting down of the Malaysian Boeing over Donbass by Russian forces with Russian weapons, or during the war in Syria. They will blame everyone just to justify their own actions. They will say that there are various versions, different versions, and it is impossible to establish which which one of those versions is true. They will even say that the bodies of those killed were allegedly thrown away, and all videos are staged. But it is 2022 now. We have conclusive evidence, so there are satellite images. We can conduct full and transparent investigation. That is what we are interested in. Maximum access for journalists, maximum cooperation with international institutions, involvement of the International Criminal Court, complete truth and full accountability. I'm sure that every member state of the UN should be interested in this. For what? In order to punish once and for all those who consider themselves privileged and believe that they can get away with anything. So show all the other potential war criminals in the world how they will be punished. If the biggest one is punished, then everyone is punished. Why did Ukraine come to Ukraine? I will tell you, because Russia's leadership feels like colonizers. In ancient times, they need our wealth, our people. Russia has already deported hundreds of thousands of our citizens to their country. They abducted more than 2,000 children, just simply conducted those children and continue to do so. Russia wants to turn Ukraine into silent slaves. The Russian military are looting openly the cities and villages that they have captured. This is wide-scale looting. They are stealing everything, starting with food, ending with earrings, gold earrings that are pulled out and covered with blood. We are dealing with a state that is turning the veto into the UN Security Council into the right to die. This undermines the whole architecture of global security. It allows them to go unpunished. So they are destroying everything that they can. So if this continues, the countries will rely only on the power of their own arms to ensure their security, and not on international law, not rely on international institutions. The United Nations can be simply closed. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to close the UN? Do you think that the time of international law is gone? If your answer is no, then you need to act immediately. The UN Charter must be restored immediately. The UN system must be reformed immediately so that the veto is not the right to die, that there is a fair representation in the Security Council of all regions of the world. The aggressor must be brought to peace immediately. Determination is needed. The massacre from Syria to Somalia, from Afghanistan to Yemen and Libya, that should have been stopped a long time ago, to tell you the truth. If tyranny had at least once received such a response to the war it had waged, it would have ceased to exist, and honest peace had been guaranteed after it, and the world would have changed for sure. And then perhaps there would not be war in my country against our people, against Ukrainian people, against our citizens, but the world watched and did not want to see either the occupation of Crimea or the war against Georgia or taking the entire Transnistria from Moldova, and how Russia was preparing the basis for other conflicts and wars near their borders. How to stop it? Right away, the Russian military and those who gave them orders must be brought to justice immediately for war crimes in Ukraine. Anyone who has given criminal orders and carried out them by killing our people will be brought before the tribunal, which should be similar to the Nuremberg tribunals. I would like to remind Russian diplomats that a man like von Ribbentrop has not escaped punishment for crimes in World War II. I would also like to remind you that Adolf Eichmann also did not go unpunished. Nobody of them escaped the punishment. But the main thing is today it's time to transform the system, the United Nations. So therefore, I propose to convene a global conference, and we can do it here in peaceful Kyiv in order to determine how we are going to reform the world security system, how we will rely, how do we establish guarantee of recognition of borders and integrity of states and countries, how we will assert the rule of international law. It is now clear that the goals set in San Francisco in 1945 for the creation of a global security international organization have not been achieved, and it is impossible to achieve them without reforms. Therefore, we must do everything in our power to pass on to the next generation an effective UN with the ability to respond preventively to security challenges and thus guarantee peace, prevent aggression, and force aggressors to peace, have the determination and ability to punish if the principles of peace are violated. There can be no more exceptions or privileges. Everybody must be equal. All participants of international relations, regardless of economic strength, geographical area, and individual ambitions. The power of peace must become dominant. The power of justice and the security power, as humanity has always dreamed of it. Ukraine is ready to provide a platform for one of the main offices of the newly updated security system, similar to the Geneva office that deals with human rights, the Nairobi office that deals with environmental protection, and in Kyiv we can have U24 office that can specialize in preventive measures to maintain peace. I would like to remind you of our peaceful mission in Afghanistan. When we Ukrainians evacuated from that country more than 1,000 people from at our own expense. It was a very difficult phase, and Ukraine came to their help. We took in people of different nationalities, ethnic groups, different faiths, Afghan citizens of European countries, US, Canada. We did not look who needed help. Was it one of our own or somebody else? We helped all of them. We saved everyone. If every time there was a need, everyone in the world would be confident that help would come, the world would be definitely safer. Therefore, Ukraine has the moral right to propose a reform of the world security system. We have proven that we helped others not only happy time, but in dark times too. And now we need decisions from the Security Council for peace in Ukraine. If you do not know how to make this decision, you can do two things. Either remove Russia as an aggressor and a source of war, so it cannot block decisions about its own aggression, its own war, and then do everything that we can do to establish peace. Or the other option is, please show how we can reform or change, dissolve yourself and work for peace. Or if there is no alternative and no option, then the next option would be dissolve yourself altogether. And I know that you can admit that if there is nothing that you can do besides conversation, we need peace. Ukraine needs peace, Europe needs peace, and the world needs peace. And finally, I would kindly ask you very much to watch this short video. Please give us 1 more minute of your time, the video that we want to show that one country can violate rights. And that's the result of being unpunished. If possible, please watch this video, because it is impossible to get everyone to come to our country and see it with your own eyes. Therefore, I would ask you to watch this video. Thank you very much.
The video. They have the video. They have to. I'm not sure. The video, is it just coming?
Madam President, the video has been uploaded to the technicians of the Security Council. So they have it in their possession.
We will sort that one out. Technically, we don't have the video. So I propose that while we sort that out, I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelensky for his compelling and powerful remarks. We will come back to the video when we've sorted out the technical issues around it. And may I say, speaking in my national capacity, may I express appreciation to the President for his leadership in wartime and for the extraordinary fortitude and bravery of the Ukrainian people under this unprovoked and illegal invasion. I resume my function as the President of the Security Council, and while we sort out the technical video, I propose to give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also start by thanking UAE and Ambassador Nisibeh for her successful presidency during the month of March. Madam President, as you begin your Security Council presidency, I want to thank the United Kingdom for your leadership and for organizing this vital discussion on Ukraine today. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the other briefers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to President Zelensky. I was so moved by the address he made recently to our Congress, and we are truly honored by his presence here under the circumstances that he and Ukraine face today. Madam President, last night I returned from a trip to Moldova and Romania. I saw with my own eyes the refugee crisis caused by Russia's unconscionable war. I spoke to refugees who indicated to me their desires to return to their home. And we've all seen the images on TV of the bombed out buildings. But what we have not seen is that behind those destroyed buildings are destroyed lives and destroyed families. I met with women and children who had fled Ukraine, who stuffed their lives into backpacks and left the only home they had ever known. And these were sobering conversations. One young woman I spoke to came with her 6-year-old brother who had autism and is struggling with cancer. Their single mother helped them escape to save their lives. But Russia's war has interrupted the care her brother desperately needs. Another woman I spoke to fled with her 8-year-old from Odessa. The father, who they'd left behind, told them there was shelling right next to their apartment that very night. And they very well could have died had they not left. A third woman I met told me that she used to love to travel, but never expected her next trip would be to flee for her life. When I asked her where she was from, she started to say, and then she stopped with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it, whether I live in Kyiv or whether I used to live in Kyiv." She was realizing in the moment just how dramatically her life had changed because of this senseless war. These are 3 stories of more than 10 million people, 6 million internally displaced, 4 Slovakia, Hungary, and others across the region and the world to welcome and support all those leaving Ukraine in search of safety. Ukraine's neighbors are bearing the brunt of Europe's most significant refugee crisis since World War II. And I want these countries to know that they have a committed partner in the United States. And that is why the United States announced recently that we are prepared to provide more than $1 billion in new funding toward humanitarian assistance for those affected by Russia's war in Ukraine and its severe impact around the world. And it is why we are welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing Russia's aggression to the United States. We will continue to assist humanitarian efforts to help the people of Ukraine and all those fleeing Putin's violence.